In 1928, a sense of doom fell over the Nazi Party. They had managed to secure only 2.6% of the vote in national elections. It had been a good year for the Weimar Republic. Political chaos had subsided, and German workers saw their incomes increase by 10%. Unsurprisingly, Hitler's brand of messianic politics, hate speech, and calls for war had little appeal in a period that Germans came to call the Golden Twenties. In fact, it was dumb luck that Hitler and his party had even survived this long. During the 1923 beer hall push, when Hitler tried to overthrow the Bavarian government, police shot his bodyguard, who literally fell on top of him and took another 5 bullets. Hitler escaped, essentially unharmed, hiding out in a supporter's home, which was subsequently surrounded by police. He pulled out his pistol, threatening to shoot himself, when his host pulled the gun out of his hand and threw it into a barrel filled with flour, thereby delaying Hitler's suicide until after tens of millions of people had died and Europe was destroyed. Then there were the scandals, none of which seemed to stick. For example, there were rumors both inside and outside Nazi circles that Hitler was having an affair with his half-niece, Geli Raubal, who later died under mysterious circumstances, either suicide or murder. The only thing we know for certain was that the pistol used belonged to Hitler. Perhaps Hitler's greatest stroke of luck was the global financial crisis that plunged Germany into economic despair in the 1930s. Germany was especially exposed because its economy relied heavily on short-term loans provided by American banks. When anxious American bankers started recalling these loans, the effects were acute and dramatic. Unemployment skyrocketed. From 8.6% in 1928, it steadily increased to 22.7% in 1930 and to an astonishing 43.8% in 1932. Compare this to the United States, which had an unemployment rate of 23.6% in 1932. The popularity of anti-democratic parties grew in direct proportion to the level of unemployment. By the 1930 German federal election, the Nazis had become the second largest party with 18.3% of the vote, just behind the SPD, or Social Democratic Party, with 24.5%. The KPD, or German Communist Party, which was equally anti-democratic, but the avowed enemy of the Nazis, saw its share of the vote grow from 10.6% in 1928 to 13.1% in 1930. By the July 1932 federal election, the Nazis had become the largest political party in Germany, with 37.3% of the vote. Much has been made of the fact that Hitler never received the support of a majority of Germans. But this misses 2 crucial points. The first is how parliamentary democracies work. It's extremely common for no political party to get a majority of votes in a national election. In these situations, one of the larger parties forms a coalition with a smaller party or smaller parties to propel its candidate to the office of Chancellor. For example, Olaf Scholz became Chancellor of Germany in 2021, but his party secured only 25.7% of the vote. This was possible because of a 3-party coalition in the Reichstag. No one would question Scholz's legitimacy as a German Chancellor. The second thing to note is that if we look at the July 1932 German federal elections as a referendum on democracy, the results are quite grim. Combining the votes of the anti-democratic parties, they added up to an outright majority of the vote at 58%. As the popularity of the Nazis increased, so did the strength of their militia, the Sturmabteilung, more commonly known as the Stormtroopers. In 1927, they were a formidable force of roughly 7,000, but by June 1932, they had reached 400,000 men, or 4 times the size of the regular army, which had been capped at 100,000 by the Treaty of Versailles. While other political parties like the KPD or even the Social Democrats had their own militias, none was as powerful as the Stormtroopers. On more than one occasion, the Stormtroopers had threatened Hitler's own leadership of the party, showing how their increasing power had begun to threaten the party itself. There had been 2 mutinies, one in 1930 and the other in 1931. Disgusted by the lavish lifestyles that the Nazi party leaders were leading, the Stormtroopers had demanded better pay. Many also insisted that Hitler stop working within the democratic system and instead seize power through violent means. Hitler managed to smooth things over, but the stormtroopers continued to be a dangerous source of instability inside the Nazi Party. Outside of the party, politicians were worried that they could launch a coup or start a civil war. This was the backdrop against which a set of reluctant but self-interested enablers within the political and industrial establishment would help propel Hitler to power. Hitler was not the only politician vying for dictatorial power, but with undeniable popularity and the implicit and explicit threat of violence, he was able to outmaneuver them all. First, we need to understand a few things about how the Weimar Republic's constitution worked. Executive power resided in the Chancellor and the President of the Republic. When a single party or a coalition of parties comprising a majority of the Reichstag could agree on a governing coalition, the President served a largely ceremonial role, essentially placing his seal of approval on the will of the people. But when there was neither a dominant party nor coalition in the Reichstag, the President could use his discretion to select a chancellor without the consent of the Reichstag, or Parliament. That said, if a majority of the members of the Reichstag were unhappy with the chancellor or any of his cabinet ministers, they could perform a vote of no confidence, meaning that new elections would have to be held. The last chancellor that had the democratic support of the Reichstag was the coalition government of Hermann Müller. The coalition included the SPD and a variety of center-right parties, including the Catholic Center Party. Unfortunately, the coalition couldn't agree on anything, and to make matters worse, Müller was in poor health. He eventually resigned, triggering the federal election of 1930. In many ways, this was the beginning of the end for German democracy. Extremist parties, on the left and the right, were the primary beneficiaries of the election, and a centrist coalition within the Reichstag became impossible. This left President Hindenburg with the power to appoint a government of his choosing that at the very least would not unify the Reichstag in a vote of no confidence. For chancellor, he selected Heinrich Brüning, a Catholic center politician with an intense work ethic and a monarchist bent. Brüning had been an officer in the German military during World War I, which appealed to the elderly former General Hindenburg. Unfortunately, Brüning's plan for how to fix the depressed German economy achieved exactly the opposite of the intended results. Instead of engaging in deficit government spending to stimulate the economy, Brüning embarked on an austerity program that cut government spending and increased taxes. His policies were such an abysmal failure that Germans started calling him the Hunger Chancellor. Despite Brüning's unpopularity with average Germans, he was well liked by industrialists who at one point urged him to become dictator, an offer he rejected. Chancellor Brüning was simultaneously fearful and dismissive of Hitler, though he probably did more than any of his successors to bring the Nazis under control. He saw the Nazis' recent electoral success as a quote-unquote temporary fever. When asked if he could provide spots in his cabinet for the newly popular Nazis, he replied no, never, under no circumstances, though he later showed some willingness to compromise with Hitler. When Hitler later ran against Hindenburg for president of the Republic, Brüning did everything he could to support Hindenburg's candidacy, a favor that would later be repaid with betrayal. Ultimately, Brüning's stance against the Nazis cost him his job. Remember, Brüning was in power solely because President Hindenburg had willed it. He had never been popular enough to secure the chancellorship through democratic means, but nor was he so unpopular that the Reichstag could topple him. Recognizing the existential threat that the Nazis posed to Germany, he had repeatedly tried to rein them in by temporarily shutting down their newspapers or by placing restrictions on the stormtroopers. For example, he had outlawed the purchase of blunt weapons and the wearing of military-style uniforms. In 1932, after months of violence against German Jews and rival political parties, government intelligence found stormtrooper documents suggesting that a coup was imminent. Ironically, Hitler was terrified that his unwieldy militia, fueled by beer, resentment, and desperation, might make him unpalatable to the German establishment. At the same time, he recognized that his popularity alone was insufficient to win him power. He also understood that because firearms were banned from political militias, the numerically inferior German army could still decimate the stormtroopers with their machine guns. He therefore tried to calm the stormtroopers by telling them that their day would come. They just had to be patient. At the same time, he was trying to reassure members of the industrial and political elites that they were not as violent or anti-Semitic as they seemed. Hitler's insecurity was not so apparent to some of the right-wing schemers inside the Brüning government who saw an opportunity to exploit Hitler's popularity for their own ends while simultaneously reining him in. Kurt von Schleicher was an underling of Brüning's defense minister Wilhelm Groener. Schleicher had hatched a plan with other German army generals to absorb the stormtroopers into the German army and to call it a national militia, which would presumably not be a violation of the Versailles Treaty. Doing so would take the stormtroopers out of Hitler's control, essentially defanging the Nazis. Instead, in April of 1932, Groener, fearful of a coup d'etat led by the stormtroopers, banned the organization outright. Soon, German police were occupying stormtrooper offices. Schleicher was furious that his plans had been thwarted, and Ernst Röhm, leader of the stormtroopers, suggested they violently resist. Schleicher went behind his boss's back to create a back channel to Hitler. With the support of two of President Hindenburg's confidants, he offered Hitler a position in a future right-wing government created by President Hindenburg. For Hitler's backing, Schleicher promised him two things: removing the prohibition on the stormtroopers and dissolving the Reichstag, which would lead to new federal elections. Schleicher then informed his boss, Defense Minister Groener, that he no longer had the support of the German army, after which Groener resigned. Now it was time to get rid of Brüning, who had already fallen out of favor with the right-wing Hindenburg over his collaboration with the Social Democrats and his support for a plan to redistribute the land of bankrupt aristocrats. An aristocratic landowner himself, Hindenburg was not a fan of this plan, but the true reason behind Brüning's dismissal was the scheming by Schleicher. Looking for a caretaker chancellor until elections would be held a few months later, Schleicher convinced Hindenburg to appoint Schleicher's old drinking buddy, Franz von Papen, a political nobody whom Schleicher hoped would keep the chancellor's seat warm until it was his time to occupy it. With more than 37% of the vote, the 1932 federal elections were a huge win for the Nazis. Hitler had anticipated this. With the stormtroopers active again and his increased popularity, Hitler's bargaining power had increased dramatically. Hitler demanded that Nazis hold key positions in the Papen government. Papen refused. Hitler further demanded that given his popularity, he would accept nothing less than chancellorship in the new government. Hindenburg could not accept this. He did not trust Hitler, fearing that if he were chancellor, he would turn Germany into a one-party state, nor was he a fan of the violent anti-Semitism that the Nazis espoused. Hitler walked out of Hindenburg's office in a huff, refusing to compromise. He then encouraged the stormtroopers to unleash a wave of anti-Semitic violence in a preview of what was to come. Papen raised the penalties for political violence up to and including the death penalty. When 5 stormtroopers were convicted of the murder of a young communist, Hitler promised to support them in their legal fight. Now that the Nazis were the biggest party in the Reichstag, they joined forces with the communists for a vote of no confidence. Franz von Papen tried to convince Hindenburg to support him in an effort to become dictator by suspending the Reichstag and elections. But the old general feared a civil war and refused. Instead, Schleicher saw this as his opportunity. He convinced Hindenburg to make him chancellor and promised that he would bring Hitler into his cabinet in a way that would keep him under control and later marginalize him. Instead, Hitler refused to be part of a Schleicher cabinet unless he was chancellor. Interestingly, Hitler's refusal to compromise had begun to frustrate Nazi Party leaders. They were eager to gain power and could not understand why Hitler would not enter the government when given the opportunity, or better yet, use force to overthrow it. This frustration culminated in the resignation of the organizational head of the Nazis, Gregor Strasser. Schleicher was in for his own surprise when Papen outmaneuvered him by creating his own back channel to Hitler and Hindenburg. Schleicher had tried to build a broader coalition to support his government, but was unsuccessful. One place where he saw some success was that he had embarked on a program of public works projects that would employ millions of Germans, but this effort would not come to fruition until after Papen had successfully convinced Hindenburg to dismiss Schleicher as chancellor. Schleicher had tried desperately to hold on to power by first asking Hindenburg to permanently dissolve the Reichstag and suspend elections. Later, he tried to form a coalition with Gregor Strasser, the former Nazi leader who had resigned from the party. Fearing a coup orchestrated by Schleicher, Hindenburg, Papen, and Hitler joined forces to expedite his removal. Papen relinquished his demand to be chancellor and gave that spot to Hitler in return for being vice-chancellor. Papen promised Hindenburg that Hitler could be controlled. Hindenburg had been unhappy with Schleicher because of his recent leftward lean. Hitler sweetened the deal for Hindenburg by promising to make Hindenburg's son a member of his cabinet. Schleicher, the schemer, had been out-schemed and was duly sacked. Hitler was now the most powerful man in Germany. He wasted little time in dismantling what little was left of German democracy. Within 4 weeks of taking office, Hitler hit the jackpot again when a young Dutch communist probably, emphasis on probably, tried to burn down the Reichstag. Some people believed it was a false flag operation by the Nazis. Making good use of a political crisis, as he had promised in Mein Kampf, Hitler claimed that a communist insurrection was underway and banned the Communist Party while suspending German civil liberties and unleashing a wave of violent political repression. Soon afterwards, all political parties were banned. 1 year later, in 1934, he murdered his right-wing rivals in an event that came to be known as the Night of the Long Knives. Kurt Schleicher and his wife, along with Gregor Strasser and Ernst Röhm, head of the stormtroopers, and many others, were murdered. When President Hindenburg died, Hitler merged the chancellorship and presidency into a single office that he occupied. All of this was accomplished with a legal patina delicately applied by Nazi lawyers who claimed that it was all legal under the Weimar Republic's constitution. It might surprise viewers that the Weimar Constitution was actually in effect until 1945, the end of World War II. How did German democracy commit suicide? Was it an irreconcilable culture war? A flawed constitution? Self-interested politicians who cared more about power than their republic? A breakdown in the democratic order that compromised the democratic state's monopoly on violence? An inability to solve a national economic crisis? Or were all of these things simply the result of an unhealthy politics that ordinary citizens tolerated or enthusiastically engaged in? Certainly some people had read Mein Kampf and listened to Hitler's speeches. This 1932 SPD election poster is especially chilling. It predicted exactly what would happen if the Nazis came to power. All these things came to pass. A fascist dictatorship, war, and eventually, at least in the eastern part of the country, a communist regime. The SPD had made a desperate appeal to the German electorate to protect civil liberties from monarchists, communists, and fascists. But not enough people listened.